Hey everybody, it's the Bald Man once again, and I'm here with another lesson. This time we'll be talking about the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve measures inflation and unemployment, and if you remember, if we add those together, we get the misery index. Also, if we have a high instance of both at the same time, high inflation, high unemployment, we refer to that as stagflation. Right. You'll notice that we have an LRPC, SRPC, and NRU. The LRPC stands for long run Phillips curve, while the SRPC is the short run Phillips curve, and NRU is short for the natural rate of unemployment, so which again is 5%. So think of the LRPC as being similar to the LRAS, which is similar to the PPC. Anything that affects the PPC and the LRAS will affect the LRPC, and we'll have to either shift it left or to the right, depending on what is happening, right? Now, as far as the rest of the graph, how does it work? There are only two rules that we need to remember for this specific graph. Now, I wouldn't recommend you working on this graph alone. Whenever you're about to work on this graph, I recommend that you draw an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph alongside with it. Why would we do that? Well, let me explain to you right now. Because this graph has two simple rules. If there is a change in aggregate demand in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, then you don't move the short run Phillips curve at all. You just shift a point along the short run Phillips curve depending on the situation. Now, I have a couple of examples ready to go, and you'll see exactly what I mean in a second, right? But just know if there is a change in aggregate demand on your aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, then you're going to move a point along the short run Phillips curve. In this graph, you're not going to move the curve at all. You're just going to move a point along the curve. What if there is a change in aggregate supply? Well, that's a very good question. If there is a change in aggregate supply, this is when we shift the curve either to the right or to the left, depending on what happened on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. And like I said, I have a couple of examples ready to go. All right, so we can clearly see that this economy is in equilibrium, and we're going to do something to it, and we'll see how the Phillips curve reacts to it, right? So in this case, we are going to pretend that the government has increased its spending. Government spending is a shifter of aggregate demand. Since they are spending more, that means aggregate demand is going to increase and shift to the right. We now have a new level of output, which means we're overextended right now, and we have a new higher price level. How would we reflect this, what happened in this graph, to the Phillips curve graph? Well, easy, right? We remember the rule was if there is a movement of aggregate demand, we're not going to move the short run Phillips curve, we're going to move along the curve, right? And we started in equilibrium, so I'm going to label this point A, and I am going to see what happened to the price levels in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. We can see price levels went up, so I need to move my point B up the SRPC. Why? Because it's going to show a new higher level of inflation, which is exactly what happened with prices. Prices went up, which means inflation has to go up in my short run, long run Phillips curve, and I have a new level of output. This is how we would show the change in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph in our Phillips curve graph. Now, what about if aggregate supply moves? Well, let's have one for that too. Again, we're in equilibrium. But this time, let's say that we have a new discovery of oil, which has basically doubled the world's oil supply. What is going to happen in my aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph? I have this increase in aggregate supply. Now that we have this abundance of oil, our prices decrease and our level of output increases. How are we going to show this on the Phillips curve graph? Well, I'm going to look at what happened to price levels. Price levels went down. Ooh, sorry about that. So I see price levels are down. So that's going to automatically tell me that inflation has to decrease. And if I go back to page 1, the rule is if there is a change in aggregate supply, then I have to move the short run Phillips curve either to the left or to the right. So looking at this graph, I can definitely see the price level has gone down. That means inflation has gone down. That means I have to shift my short run Phillips curve to the left, and we show a new level of inflation, which was lower than before, which reflects what's happening in the price level. And that is how I would know that what I just did is correct. What's happening in the price level, is that reflected in my Phillips curve? Yes, okay, odds are I did the correct thing. If you guys have any questions, please send me a message on Remind or drop a comment down below.